Hello and welcome to the Sports Pro podcast. Now, before we start the show, I just wanted to give you a little nudge to talk about our sister podcast. That is Streamtime Sports. It features my colleague Chris Stone and Sports Pro CEO Nick Meacham, and it's published weekly, covering all of the latest news and developments in the sports media space, with a special focus on the people, businesses and technologies driving the sports streaming revolution. It comes out every Wednesday and is the go-to place for broadcast professionals. Streamtime Sports wherever you get your podcasts. Hello and welcome to another edition of the Sports Pro podcast. I'm your host, as ever, Tom Bassam, and on this week's episode, we're going to be talking about some of the challenges you maybe wouldn't have thought about for the increasing professionalisation of women's sport, in particular women's football. Obviously, women's football has gone through a radical shift in the last few years, going from semi-pro to professional, with women's salaries and endorsements exploding in value over the last few years. Now, obviously, there's still a way to go in comparison with how much their male counterparts earn, but still, there are now some increasingly wealthy women's footballers in the UK and elsewhere, which creates some new problems. Now, these are problems that have been prevalent in the men's game for a while. How do you make sure that you protect your income for what is still a relatively short career at the top end of your earning potential? What happens if you get injured and can't play anymore? How do clubs deal with these increasingly valuable assets, aka players? Now, to answer some of those questions, I spoke to a couple of real experts in this field. Arthur Fane, a Miller Insurance account executive on their sports team, and Sophie Barrington, who leads on sports and entertainment in Barclays' wealth management division. These guys are able to provide a really fantastic insight into the changing nature of the women's professional game, with a real sort of focus on the UK and the WSL. Arthur and Sophie were able to provide a real insight into the real conversations that are being had at the top of the women's game and the changing nature of women's professional sport, especially in the UK. Yeah, we had a really fascinating conversation. Rather than sort of hear me waffle on about it anymore, maybe we just cut over to Arthur and Sophie. I'm in a slightly different location for today's podcast. I am sat in the heart of the city in a very impressive looking conference room with a lovely backdrop. And I'm joined by Arthur Fane and Sophie Barrington. Hello, Sophie. Hello, Arthur.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks for having us.
That's an absolute pleasure. I think this is going to be good fun. We're here to talk a little bit about the rapidly changing world of WSL stars, Women's Super League stars, female athletes in general, but I guess with a bigger focus on women's football. Now, Sophie, you play at an amateur level. How have you seen the game develop and the women's game develop in the recent years, just watching from a sort of a layman's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the kind of biggest changes that I've definitely seen are the kind of athletes and players themselves becoming more of that role model figure across the sport and having that more kind of commerciality about the game that wasn't really there sort of 20 years ago when I was growing up. We didn't really have many kind of female role models that I could have looked at and thought, I want to be them one day. So I did the next best thing and found a job where I could still work in sport and football. I think as well, a great kind of progressive point that we've seen is around more professionalism of the game, both in terms of the standard that it's been played at, but also the opportunities that that brings in terms of increasing salaries and kind of more opportunities for the players, which all positive things.
Oh yeah, for sure. We're still a long way short of parity across the two games, but as we've seen that increasing professionalisation, wages have gone up, the risk level for those players and their careers has gone up too. There's generally a lot more things that you'd attach to being a Premier League footballer that now come with being a WSL footballer. More at the top end of that league than the average, but in general, we're sort of moving in that direction. Arthur, like working in the sort of insurance side of it, what does that mean for you guys? What kind of changes have you seen and how have you had to adapt your business?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, on the perspective of professionalism, I couldn't believe actually seeing that Rachel Yankee in 2000 was the first professional female footballer in England, which is a lot later than I thought it was, which is pretty staggering. But as the game expands in this country, or in the world, it's a massive risk when they're performing at the top level. You know, the intensity of a 90-minute game. Sophie can definitely talk more about that than I can. But no, we're seeing in the news massive increases in ACL injuries, perhaps in football. I think I read the other day that there have been, since 2022, over 375 ACL injuries in women's football, which is
staggering amount
for a specific injury, is really, really staggering. And if you do get an ACL injury, it costs a lot of money to have surgery. I think at the top level of women's football, the club would cover that, but as you go down the football pyramid, it's, sometimes the clubs won't have the money to do that. I think it's maybe 30 grand in London to repair an ACL. So, there's massive financial burden with that as well.
I guess with that financial burden, someone's got to pay for it somewhere. Does that mean that you guys have to kind of create unique products for this kind of thing? Is that what you're seeing in the market?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we're definitely reacting to in the rise of women's sport, but also particularly women's football, because, it's so well publicised how brilliantly it's doing at the moment, growing at such a massive rate. We're reacting to that. We're trying to put together specific products, perhaps covering injuries like an ACL, because it's such a problem. We're trying to react to that. If we can put together a product that would pay a lump sum for, let's say, an ACL injury, that can go towards the surgery. If perhaps their club isn't going to cover it, it could go towards retraining.
So rehab in itself is not going to be cheap.
And obviously a massive slog. Footballers who've suffered ACL injuries are out for at least a year, really. So that's a real burden to take a year off your playing career from one injury. So anything that any of us from a financial perspective can do to help that, it's great. Yeah.
Typically, like, your reaction to that, is that clubs coming to you and saying, we need to be insured against this thing? Or is that individual players come to you and saying, I need to protect myself here in case something pretty nasty and horrible happens that means I can't play anymore or I can't work?
It's a variety of different people in that player's life. It could be the club who put them in contact with us. It could be the player themselves who takes it upon themselves. It could be the agent. It could be the wealth managers. It could be anyone who's involved in that player's career. But, definitely from our perspective, I mean, from an insurance standpoint, you can insure if you're temporarily not able to continue your career. You can insure if you're permanently not able to continue your career. And, certainly in the women's game, as Sophie says, like, the money in it is going only one way. There's obviously a long way to go still, but at this stage, it's growing and growing and growing. You look at someone like Sam Kerr, who is probably one of the higher paid players, I believe. She's got a lot of annual income to protect. If she can't play again for the rest of her career, that's a hell of a loss to her, and so she'll want to make sure that's covered. But it could be a number of different people we'll deal with.
I think as well, just to say, part of it, I think they don't necessarily know what they don't have. So it's not until kind of they probably hear someone like you talk about it, or someone in the industry, be it the club or an agent, kind of explain to them the risks, that it wouldn't necessarily be something that you go into a match and think, oh, I'm going to get injured today, or into a training session. So it's one of them things that no one wants to think about and wants to talk about. So it's always that kind of all back of your head until that kind of shock factor hits, and by that point obviously it's too late for a lot of players.
And is that sort of where you kind of come into this picture, Sophie, as a like working in that wealth management side? Are you advising players this is something you need to be protected against, and these are the kind of places you can go to do that?
Yeah, it's definitely something that we're proactively talking about, if nothing else, just to kind of educate people generally about finances and kind of looking at things, and we can put the best budget in place possible for a player to hit every financial goal they want. But if their career ends early, there's only certain things you can do to kind of insure against that. And that's where obviously people like Arthur at Miller's can be incredibly helpful at kind of providing that service. But it's then obviously handed over to these guys who know what they're talking about in terms of the detail on it.
Like, what are some of those like different things that they can come in and ask for? I mean, you sort of said there are some products for it, but perhaps if you could spell out what those different options are.
So on a career-ending injury standpoint, I mean, it's incredible that in France and Germany, for example, looking outside this country, Germany particularly, the female Bundesliga is also booming in the same way that the WSL is. In Germany, 42 days after a player gets injured, the club no longer by law needs to pay that player. And in France, it's for 90 days. And therefore, that temporary product of covering that loss of earnings is incredibly important in those countries. In this country, I believe it's 18 months. A player can have an injury. You look at clubs like Chelsea, they're paying players for maybe 8 or 9 years now, but, there's only so much solidity that provides. And so we can cover temporary total disablement. So for a period of time, a player will be disabled from playing football. We can look to reimburse that lost salary, so the player can, as long as they can justify it, can get any sum insured. And same for a permanent injury, they can look to ensure a multiple of annual salary, and that might be your salary itself and also your contracts and endorsements that would obviously not be in place if you can't play the game. So yeah, we can tailor products to these players. Absolutely. I think one of the main things is that retraining and planning for that next step after your playing career is done. There are only a certain number of jobs in sports media that those players can access after they finish playing. And so, they'll absolutely want to consider what that next step is. Yes, they get their insurance payout, hopefully, but it's that next step. What are they going to do? What's the next step?
Yeah, I'd like to come to that shortly. Before we move on to sort of that wealth management and career, I guess, protection side of it, are clubs coming to you as well and looking for similar things? They're now obviously making larger financial commitments to female players too, and if they're losing them for periods of time, they also probably need to be protected against that as well.
Absolutely. There's two sides of it. The player's own benefit, so they're getting insurance for their own future potential salary and earning potential. And then the club is making a large investment, looking at the men's game. Obviously, the transfer fees are significantly higher than the women's game, but, all being well, the women's game will catch up on that front. So the club is making a very, very big investment financially at that first step. And then they're also committing to paying a large salary for a fairly long period of time. So the club, they'll need to make considerations of replacing that player if they are injured, but also the sunk cost with what they are committed to paying for that player. So there's definitely clubs who are interested in this cover, and we do work with a number of them.
Is that something that you've seen really change in the last few years? I'm guessing they've got that already in place for the men's side, but more and more I'm guessing it's coming on the women's side too.
Yeah, it's education really from our perspective. Sophie said it, it's just telling the clubs what's available, what can be bought. And clubs are historically bundled, really, male and female teams in one. And, Brighton Football Club, for example, is really very proud and have great vision for their women's football side. And, they appreciate they've got, big assets, great players on their books, and they want to make sure that they insure them. They look after them from a safeguarding perspective as well as a financial perspective.
So typically, is that how it is at the moment? Both clubs are put together. Is that always going to be able to be the case if the sort of costs attached to both can keep going up? Are you going to need to say at some point, actually, you guys are going to need separate products for this?
Absolutely. From an unbundling perspective, we've seen with, the Women's Professional Leagues Limited breaking from the FA. It's a really, really positive move. I think Barclays have some involvement with that.
Yeah, we might be title sponsors. Very proud of that. But as well as the ACL, I guess, issue in women's football is so much bigger than has been in the men's game as well. So that kind of, I guess, differentiation in terms of probably some of the underlying products and injuries that you're seeing, I can imagine are probably quite different as well from the two.
Definitely, absolutely.
Yeah. To move on a little bit towards some of the other changes that you're seeing, and Sophie, maybe I can come to you first on this, with sort of that increasing move towards equal pay, and we're obviously a very, very long way short of that. It's something we cover quite extensively at Sports Pro. The top salaries do not really compare currently, but the likes of Sam Kerr, as you mentioned, Arthur, are moving towards places where they're going to need to think about what they do with their money more. Are you still at that education point when it comes to the women's game?
Yeah, I think, again, it depends completely on kind of the individual player and kind of where they're at in terms of salary and commercial deals. But for us, it's that education piece in terms of making sure for them, whatever salary level that is, they know the importance of making sure they've got a financial plan in place. Obviously, salaries are increasing. Along with that can kind of come lifestyle inflation, wanting to spend more money on cars, buy a bigger house, wear more branded clothes, and you probably kind of see it around you across not just football but every industry. So kind of making clients and players aware of that's great, but actually this kind of inflation that you're seeing has an end date in terms of you're not going to be a professional footballer forever. And at some point, unfortunately, that salary will drop off. So it's kind of really making them aware that when that happens, that's when you want to have that plan B, that plan C. And that's why kind of savings, investing in the background can be really important in terms of forming part of that plan for some clients to make sure that they've got that income stream when they do retire and that they're not in a position where they do just kind of start spending more because they're earning more without thinking about what could then come later down the line.
I kind of feel like I have to caveat each of these things because it's all a sliding scale. But with that kind of relative wealth income increase, what kind of investments are you seeing? Where are female players directing their investments increasingly, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, a number of different things, and it wouldn't probably be right of me to kind of sit here and go through kind of a right solution for everyone today. It's definitely not kind of a one size fits all. But what I do think is really interesting is the confidence that a lot of women tend to have towards investing, because we do see that in general across the board, more men are investing. And I've got an interesting stat actually that the FCA did a study called the Financial Lives Survey in 2023. So again, very recent. This isn't going back to the dark ages. And it showed that almost half of men are likely to invest in comparison to under a third of women. So when you're kind of talking to WSL players who are kind of earning well, yes, they understand about looking after themselves and they want to kind of make sure that they've got that longevity of income post-retirement. But actually even that kind of investment hurdle and encouraging people to think about how they're saving money and investing can be quite difficult to overcome. And obviously investments carry risks. Investments can rise as well as fall, and you've got all the kind of normal caveats.
You have to say that, do you?
All those T's and C's you hear on the end of pretty much every financial services outfit.
And don't get me wrong, I think that's right, and it is a risky product depending on what you're looking at. So you do want to have the kind of understanding of doing it, but I think there's a massive role that we can play and kind of organisations can play in terms of educating clients and players in terms of what they are, so that they can really feel comfortable with the decisions they're making and know that they've kind of got control of their own career, albeit, as we've mentioned, they might not have control if an injury happens or anything like that, but kind of planning for what we're able to plan for.
And how does that change what you guys do, or if it does at all?
Just to pick up on that point, I think, the increasing professionalisation we've talked about. I listened to a podcast the other day where Leah Williamson was talking about being recognised on the street. She's since Euro 2022 and that brilliant win, suddenly female footballers are in the limelight. They're walking down a street and people are turning and saying, wow.
That's Leah Williamson.
Want a picture,
exactly.
selfie,
So
signature.
I've certainly got colleagues who absolutely love Leah Williamson, as do I. So I think that increased fame and in the spotlight, is something that's really important from a safeguarding perspective, and they're having to deal with different challenges perhaps that male footballers have been dealing with for a period of time. And when it comes to that responsible spending, young male footballers are earning huge contracts at 17, 18 years old now, which is something that I think at the moment female footballers are not having to deal with. But as it moves through time, that's potentially a sort of a challenge that we sort of see on the horizon.
How quickly has that happened, that change? Is that something that you've noticed working in the industry just in the last couple of years? Has it accelerated, especially since that Lionesses win?
I think the commercial side of the game has had a massive impact kind of post-Euros, to be honest with you, in terms of people getting more on board from a consumer perspective, wanting to follow the likes of Mary Earps on TikTok and all things like that. I think the kind of professionalism behind the scenes from a kind of player level perspective and facility side of stuff has probably been in the making a lot longer than that. Probably more like sort of from what I've seen income-wise, maybe 5-6 years in terms of players starting to get agents and things like that. But then more recently, I think that brand-driven kind of commerciality has really increased the last couple of years, and hopefully will continue to do so.
Absolutely. I mean, it's increasing on the commercial side in terms of attendance levels of these games. Arsenal, Man City. That's amazing to see the Emirates sell out in the Arsenal Man City game last season for the first time for a women's football game at the Emirates. So average attendances are increasing all the time. There's different spending patterns associated with female football fans, which is quite an interesting, analysis point. Those kinds of differences in terms of sponsors that the female game might attract versus the male game. The commercialization of women's sport is a really, really exciting space to be in, I think, to be a commercial partner of them. So I would definitely applaud Barclays for that, which is great. And then TV deals as well. I think screening the Women's Champions League, for example, is something that's an ever increasingly hot ticket. And so, there's all sorts of quite exciting developments within it.
With that, there comes also a bit of increased scrutiny too. And we've seen, I'm going to take Manchester United as an example here because they've had a difficult summer when it comes to their women's team. The women's team was only created 4 or 5 years ago, got to the WSL quite quickly. But since the takeover by Ineos, the women's team was famously moved out of their facilities this summer. When it comes to that rapid professionalisation and the scrutiny that comes with it, I don't know, either of you maybe in turn take this, how important is it for clubs these days to get that right, to make sure that they're creating that positive message around their women's team? you can now have a very negative brand association if you're not seen to be doing the right thing by your women's team.
Personally, I think the unbundling of the two is really quite important, because I think there needs to be a recognition of the fact that the women's game is booming, and a female team deserves to be given its own platform and shouldn't be an afterthought for the men's team. You know, I'm a Southampton fan. I'm proud that our women's football team is growing. We're in the championship at the moment, hopefully going to push for promotion. It would be very exciting to see a Southampton women's team that's significantly better than the men's team. But, you know, I think it deserves to have its own platform. So, you know, it's very sad to see what happened with Manchester United. But I absolutely believe that, you know, for example, the biggest teams in this country, Chelsea, Man City, Arsenal, probably, you know, they deserve to be kind of treated as their own entity, not as an afterthought for the men's team.
Yeah, agree. And maybe on a kind of a deeper point as well, in terms of the actual players and the commercialisation around them, I think it's difficult because obviously the clubs want to use their image, use their faces as much as possible to kind of drive things like revenue and selling out stadiums. But it can be really hard because at the end of the day, they've signed up because they want to play football and they love the sport. And from a, I guess, player perspective of then having to go through, oh, I'm no longer just a player anymore. I'm in the spotlight. I'm in the media. I need to act in a certain way. I need to do all of the right things. I think that transition in itself, I think, has been quite difficult for some players who maybe don't want that level of pressure from the kind of media side and spotlight side that wasn't really there before.
Yeah, there was a great interview with Bunny Shaw about how when she was growing up in Jamaica, she only had Usain Bolt as a sports star. And so for her to be able to act as a role model to that future generation of young Jamaican girls growing up and seeing, oh my gosh, we've got one of the best players in the world, that's really exciting for her. And I suppose there are pressures with that, but there are also like massive privileges with being a role model. And she, you know, she seems to be adapting to it incredibly well. And all the Lionesses are fantastic in front of a camera. You know, they're incredibly confident, they're incredibly effusive, obviously brilliant football players, which is great. And yeah, it's an exciting thing to be a role model, I think.
It's hard because I kind of feel like we've kind of maybe gone too much that way at the moment, whereby the actual sport side is getting a bit lost, and the sport side is fantastic. You watch some of the kind of top teams against each other, and again the Lionesses, and it's great football. And I think there's an element of kind of over branding and over commercialisation of some of it that it's taking it away a little bit. And I think it's maybe providing a bit of a false safety net in terms of, okay, well, when I retire, there's going to be commercial opportunities and I'm going to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And I think the reality could look very different for a lot of players who maybe aren't that well known, or they're not going to potentially be in the spotlight if they're not at that same club who's kind of pushing them out to the media as much, which again, obviously could impact them from like an income perspective as well. So it's all that sort of thing that I guess it's kind of our duty to just educate on and ask the questions to kind of make clients think about that sort of thing.
Is that a tough conversation to have sometimes?
Horrible. And then the agents look at you like you're... because obviously they're selling the dream and they're going to get all the best brand deals. And I'm sure they are doing their very best to do that. But you can't promise what's going to happen in the future. Nobody knows what's going to kind of continue to happen. Everyone can kind of hope it continues on this upwards trajectory and plan for that. But again, that's why insurance is so important, because there comes a time where the plan will only go so far and unexpected things happen.
The last thing you want to do is essentially put a magnifying glass on all the risks and all the scariness surrounding a sports career. But equally, we have to shine a light on it, because, you know, if the worst happens and they, you know, have this career and injury, they have no cover. It's a very difficult thing to deal with, not just financially, but also mentally as well. You know, you had this very exciting career and now you have no way of transitioning into that life after, and I guess insurance is designed to help with that transition and smooth it for the players and just allow them to play with a bit of a safety net there if the worst does happen.
I think even things like children, things like that can happen obviously out of the blue. So it's not even just, I guess, injury. You might have a change of heart. Someone who's been in the media their whole life might turn around and go, actually, you know what, I just want to go back, get a normal job and step out of the spotlight for a bit. And I think that's okay as well. I think it's just there's a lot of pressure for them to perform in every single way, in every single aspect.
It's worth saying that you can't insure against, I'm afraid. Just stepping out.
Good to know. I'll remember that when I retire from podcasting. If I could take it back to the Manchester United point a little bit, and talk about, we can talk in generalisations here slightly, but the sort of argument that Ineos would make about why they were sort of placed less emphasis on their women's team is that, yes, it's accelerating massively quickly, but it's still way, way, way behind their men's team. As we sort of talk about this rapid professionalisation, like, it's hard, isn't it, to find that balance between the two of like, okay, yes, you are getting there, but at the same time, the men's team is really still what's paying the bills here.
I just think there's two very different models at play, and I think that's completely acceptable. I think you can compare women and men's football, and people do till the cows come home, but actually there's probably a lot more other sports that kind of women's football's more comparative to on a growth trajectory perspective. But I guess the way that I'd look at it is, from my perspective, the player side is quite similar in terms of the way they receive income, how their kind of career tends to go in terms of high earnings at a younger age and then an earlier retirement. So from how I do things, there's a lot of similarities that we can draw from a financial perspective, but the actual game itself and how it's commercialised and professionalised is quite different. And I think there's nothing wrong with admitting that and kind of being proud that women's football in its own right can be a standalone entity and hopefully continue to progress more independence maybe than it's had historically.
Yeah, and I also think that there needs to be, some recognition that at times you need to, in order to generate the interest and the, boost that commercialization piece, you need to potentially make a loss as a sponsor or as a potentially having a TV rights deal. So, for example, I believe DAZN made Women's Champions League free to air.
Yeah.
And if you put it behind a paywall, then you've got to weigh up the pros and cons. Yes, you can make a little bit more money, but will you be really generating that interest in the sport, acting as a leader in trying to boost women's sport as best as you can? And I think in reneging on I think they were planning to put it behind a paywall, and that
was the original plan. So the trajectory was for there to be a kind of, in year one, we're going to do this. In year two, we're going to put this behind a paywall because we think by then we'll have generated the interest. And then I think by the time that happened, they're like, it's not quite there yet. We think we're still best positioned in this different space.
And I think that's a really great decision for the sport because, you want as many eyes on it as possible. If it's suddenly behind a paywall, a whole generation of, young girls will be reliant on a parent paying for that viewing, and as things are, they're able to view it on YouTube of their own accord. And so that's going to get them really hooked on women's football from a young age, and it will boost it from generations to come. So I think that's vital that it remains not behind a paywall for the time being.
And I'm sure DAZN have probably weighed up the longer term benefit that they probably expect to see from women's football in the kind of longer term view.
And it speaks to your point, doesn't it, that these two things, whilst they might look the same, they're presented the same, it's the same sport, they're not the same commercial product, and therefore you can actually think about how you do things differently, and that's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
I guess to bring this kind of full circle, are there any kind of major differences between the two sports when it comes to like either of your jobs professionally and the conversations that you're having to have?
I think on my side there is, but that's more from a salary perspective in terms of the amounts. Obviously, the more that someone's earning, the more in depth we can do about sort of some of the products and services that might be available to them, in contrast to maybe someone that's on a kind of lower banding salary, albeit the actual kind of premise in terms of what are your goals and objectives. We need to think about budgeting. We need to think about retirement. We need to think about how much you're spending and what you're spending money on and whether it's important to you or not. All of the topics are the same. So there's a lot of kind of synergies and overlap with the discussion. But obviously, it can kind of get a bit more complicated the more money you've got in terms of advice.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, it all hinges on the money that they earn. So I think the average WSL salary is roughly 50,000 per year, and I'm not entirely sure on the figure, but I wouldn't be surprised if the average Premier League salary was that much a week. And so, it's a completely different ball game in terms of the actual cost of the product that we offer and the amount that they would choose to or be able to justify insuring. The other side of the dice is therefore the decision that they can make to buy that insurance will be obviously a lot less expensive. And so having that safety net ultimately is the same in the men's and the women's game. It's just the pricing is different due to the amount that they can look to insure.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to stargaze into the future a little bit.
Crystal ball
time. Yeah, exactly. I should have a little sound effect with the crystal ball, shouldn't I? Maybe I'll put that on. Get your crystal balls out and give me a little projection for how quickly you see both of what you do on a professional side accelerating in a couple of years, and also maybe from a sporting side as well. Yeah, Sophie, if you want to start.
I mean, I don't know where to start with that. I think it's a difficult question because we've seen so much growth so quickly recently. I'd love to say that that's completely sustainable and we're going to continue smashing out the park for the next few years. But I think there's probably an element of realism in terms of, I think we'll probably see, I mean, salaries are probably going to be relatively static now for this season at least. So it's going to probably be another year until we then start seeing maybe a kind of additional increases in salary. I think the commercialisation will continue to see quite quickly. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more kind of retiring WSL players going into more of that kind of media role. And I think we'll see kind of income spiking a lot more from that side of things than maybe...
Is that on the sort of their non-club contracts? So all of their brand deals and stuff like that are still just rapidly going up?
I think that will continue to go, if not quicker than it already has done. And then I think we'll probably see maybe slight increases continuing across the kind of playing side of the salary level, which is quite a specific prediction given that I've got no idea what's going to happen.
That's a very good crystal ball.
Yeah, I thought that was really good. I actually had a follow-up to your crystal ball, which is, do you think that women's footballers are still sort of slightly undervalued when it comes to that commercial sense? And you can take this like professionally or not.
Yeah, massively. But I think there's also an element of not wanting to over-commercialise the players because they're football players. They're not there to boost the brand deal of a club. They're there to play football, win games, score goals. And I think it's really important that the club stay true to that, which I think, to be honest with you, they have done to date. But I would really hate to see that kind of get out of control and the players feel like they're not really players anymore and they're just there for the image and the branding side of things.
On that, I read that Chloe Kelly, I think, earns in US dollar terms 400 grand a year, let's say, and her contracts and endorsements are around $800,000. So for that to be double what she's earning is quite staggering to me. But I definitely think undervalued for sure.
Okay, and Arthur, your crystal ball.
Well, it all comes down to the earning potential. So to your point, I definitely feel women's footballers at the moment are undervalued. You look at the size of, Barclays sponsorship into the WSL, it's 45 mil across 3 years, which pales in comparison with the men's game, but it is still an enormous investment of money in the women's game, and still the players are slightly left behind. They're playing top level professional sport for 90 minutes
in front of millions of people as well.
In front of a lot of people. And, those attendances are skyrocketing, as I said, and people are showing more and more interest in it. And it's only fair that those salaries will increase. So there's not much of a crystal ball I can give to this other than I definitely anticipate it will continue growing at a similar rate, I would say.
Right, and that seems like a pretty good place to leave it. Sophie, Arthur, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom.